The Lonely Sisters of Sad Hollow by Lynn and Dave. Dave said, write a comedy novel about 4 sisters who lived in a house but were very, very lonely and really stuck to themselves, stayed by themselves. The first sister lived in the attic. She hardly ever left the attic. She felt safe in the attic. She never talks to no one. She never talked to her other sisters, but she stayed in the attic. They fed her through a little hole in the door. The second sister lived in the basement. She never left the basement. She was always in the basement. If she ever left the basement, it was at night time, and she made sure nobody saw her. She seldom ever left the basement. The third sister lived in a shed in the backyard. She never left the shed. She always in the shed. And the fourth sister lived in the kitchen. She's always cooking. She never left the kitchen. The sisters were really, really lonely, but they didn't talk to each other. They didn't talk to anyone. They're happy being lonely, but they found lots of time to do things that they enjoyed doing, like knitting and reading books. And they also were avid TV watchers. They watched all kinds of TV shows. They loved soap operas and very sad stories about relationships that broke up. Make the story very, very sad, but also very, very funny. ChatGPT said. Chapter 1, A House Divided. The house on Sad Hollow Lane was old and creaky, but it was the perfect home for the 4 mumbly sisters, Cora, Mabel, Agnes, and Tilda. Each had found her own corner of the house, and each was perfectly content to avoid the others at all costs. No one in the village had seen all 4 sisters together in decades. They're like cryptids, the grocer said once, only less friendly. But the sisters didn't care. They had their solitude, their hobbies, and most importantly, their TV shows. What more could anyone need? Chapter 2, Cora in the Attic. Cora, the eldest, had claimed the attic when she was just a teenager. It's high up and far away, she declared, climbing the creaky ladder for the last time. She lived among dusty trunks and cobwebbed rafters, knitting scarves no one would ever wear, and reading romance novels that made her cry so hard she sometimes clogged the attic's only drain pipe. Her sister slid food through a hole in the attic door, a system so ingrained that none of them had ever questioned it. Cora would poke her head out, grab the tray, and retreat without a word. Occasionally she left notes. More soup next time. No celery, for heaven's sake. Thanks, I guess. Her days were spent in glorious solitude, except for the occasional pigeon who mistook the attic window for a romantic rendezvous. Cora, for reasons even she couldn't explain, named every pigeon Stanley. Chapter 3, Mabel in the Basement. Mabel, the second sister, had a different love, darkness. She had moved to the basement after an unfortunate sunburn at age 8 and never looked back. I don't trust the daylight, she muttered, reinforcing the basement door with a padlock she kept the key to. Mabel spent her days organizing her collection of candles, which numbered well into the thousands. She believed each candle had a soul, and she whispered comforting words to them as she dusted. At night she watched true crime shows on a tiny flickering TV. People are terrible, she often sighed, but at least I'm not as bad as those serial killers. Her rare trips upstairs were stealthy affairs, like a ghost haunting its own house. She would creep to the fridge, mutter, "Excuse me," to no one in particular, and vanish back into the basement before anyone noticed. Chapter 4, Agnes in the Shed. Agnes, the third sister, chose the backyard shed because it smelled like freedom. She had moved out there one summer after a heated argument over whose turn it was to dust the fireplace. No one had even remembered the fight, but Agnes never returned. The shed was small, damp, and full of spiders, but Agnes loved it. She spent her days tinkering with old radios, convinced she could one day contact aliens. If anyone understands me, it'll be the Martians, she often muttered, while adjusting dials. She also kept a family of raccoons as roommates, naming them after characters from her favorite soap operas, Dr. Hartwell, Cassandra, and Baby Lionel. Agnes had a TV powered by a generator that rattled so loudly it could wake the neighborhood. But since none of her sisters ever ventured into the backyard, they barely noticed. Her favorite shows were paranormal dramas, which she watched while wrapped in a quilt she'd patched together from old grocery bags. Chapter 5, Tilda in the Kitchen. Tilda, the youngest, ruled the kitchen. It wasn't just a room to her. It was her entire world. She cooked like she was feeding a battalion, even though the only mouths to feed were her sisters and her own. Every surface in the kitchen was covered with pots, pans, and spices. The oven never cooled, and the smell of fresh bread wafted through the house at all hours. Tilda's only companions were a dozen mismatched aprons, each with a name. "Oh, Marjorie," she would sigh, tying one on, "let's bake some cookies." She loved cooking shows and would spend hours arguing with the television. "No, you don't need more salt," she'd shout, brandishing a rolling pin at the screen. Her sisters heard the racket and assumed she was just talking to herself, which, to be fair, she usually was. Chapter 6, The Soap Opera Summit. Despite their isolation, the sisters had one thing in common. Their love for Storms of the Heart, a soap opera so melodramatic it made grown men weep. Every Thursday night the sisters watched the latest episode, each from her own corner of the house. One fateful Thursday, the unthinkable happened. The TV antenna broke during a climactic scene where Dr. Devon revealed he wasn't really Cassandra's brother, but her long-lost twin. Each sister, in her own lonely rage, stormed out of her hideout to investigate. They collided in the living room for the first time in years, a tangle of aprons, knitting needles, and candle wax. "Who broke the TV?" Cora snapped, clutching her latest scarf. "Probably you with your knitting needles," Mabel retorted, clutching a candelabra. "Maybe it was the aliens," Agnes suggested, holding a wrench. "Why don't we just fix it and shut up?" Tilda growled, brandishing a spatula. For a moment they froze, realizing they were in the same room, talking to each other. Then they burst into laughter, awkward, wheezy laughter that hadn't graced the house in years. Chapter 7. The Moral of Sad Hollow. The sisters repaired the antenna together, though it took twice as long because they kept bickering. They even sat down in the living room to watch the episode together, which felt strange but not entirely unpleasant. Though they didn't suddenly become inseparable, they started to emerge from their hideouts more often. Cora sometimes knitted in the kitchen. Mabel let Agnes light one of her candles. Tilda baked raccoon-shaped cookies for Agnes's furry friends. Their house remained quirky, lonely, and full of strange habits. But now it had something else, the occasional sound of laughter echoing through the halls of Sad Hollow. Even the loneliest hearts can find connection. Sometimes it just takes a broken TV and a little effort.